right, welcome everyone. Thank you for those that had joined yesterday and are returning today. And for those that are here for the first time, like welcome. I just want to begin with the disclaimer. Just to reiterate that the presentation today is only for informational purposes only, and it does not constitute any kind of professional advice or services. So everybody's responsible for their own takeaway. And if you do need professional advice, you would have to seek that separately from this presentation. So today is going to be really interesting. Today we're going to be looking at the different myths around temporary and permanent immigration. And we'll also be addressing certain immigration scams and things that you have to look out for, tips and takeaways with respect to immigration and immigration scams, just red flags and things that you must know that you should look for when you're looking to immigrate to Canada. Now, I always like to begin with the Canada's landscape. It's really important that we understand that, Canada is, we have our provinces, we have our different provinces. When you're looking at immigrating to Canada is usually effort to, migrate federally, or sometimes you can migrate to a particular province. And, what I find is that one of the biggest misconceptions is that persons don't really understand the landscape of Canada. Like they're thinking of Canada as one particular landmass, and Canada, we have our different provinces with different cultures and different opportunities, whether you're studying, you're working, or whether you're looking to move to Canada permanently. So one of the main advice that I would share is that if you're looking to migrate to Canada, is not just Canada, but you should be directing your focus to someplace specific. So you should be directing your focus to a specific province. You should have a province in mind. You should be doing your background information on that province, and you should be looking to see, what are the cultural norms and what are the different types of opportunities available in that province, because immigration is, very complex. And we have, like I said, we have the provincial level, we have the federal level, and sometimes depending on where you're migrating in Canada, it would require extra steps and processes, just depending on the province. So understanding Canada's landscape is one of the biggest and most helpful things that you would do when you're looking into migrating to Canada. Now, in terms of the myths, one of the biggest myths right now, or one of the biggest talks that are going around, is that Canada, needs people and that they need workers. So immigrating to Canada is very easy. That is one of the things that we have going around. One of the things that we have going around. Now, part of it is true in a sense that Canada is one of the most sparsely populated countries. And yes, we do have an aging population, which is declining. And this actually forms some of our immigration policies, and it forms the government's perspective in how they want to fulfill those gaps that we will have in immigration. So yes, we do have a sparse population, and yes, the population is declining, but we have to understand that the standards in terms of the legitimate ways to migrate to Canada that we talked about yesterday are pretty much in place, and they're pretty much standard, and they're pretty much tight, in the sense that yes, Canada may be looking for people, Canada may be looking for workers, but it doesn't mean that they're just opening the gates, for persons to flood and come in. They do have certain requirements that you have to meet, and you do have certain programs, that you have to meet an eligibility criteria for. So it's not as easy as just, packing your suitcase and moving to Canada. Now, if you're looking to move to Canada, you should be first researching about where you want to move and about the legitimate ways to immigrate before making that move to Canada. So for those of us that are here for the first time, that didn't join us yesterday, it'll be good to look at that particular presentation that is going to be made available for you on YouTube, to look at the legitimate ways and preparing yourself before actually moving to Canada. Because like I said, in terms of moving, you should be preparing and doing your research before, right? I find that eliminates a lot of confusion, and it eliminates the chances that you're going to get scammed or that you're going to get taken advantage of. Because the more research you do for your own benefit, the more you understand the Canadian immigration, the more you understand what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And if you hear anything on the pipeline and it sounds a little suspicious or looks suspicious, at least you would have read it, you would have researched, you kind of have an idea about those legitimate ways to come to Canada. So when you do your research and something doesn't sound right, you kind of have that idea that is not right, and you could do more digging and you could ask more questions for more clarity. Now, one of the other misconceptions or confusions is, whether persons are gonna apply for permanent residence or temporary residence from inside Canada or outside Canada. I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions or the biggest confusions. Now, in terms of applying for temporary residence or applying for permanent residence, I could safely say that there's no benefit in not preparing yourself before coming to Canada and fully knowing like what program you're going to apply for, whether it's temporary or permanent before you come into Canada. So there are some circumstances where persons could apply from inside Canada, but mostly you're looking at applying from outside, right? From outside Canada. So you can apply for temporary residence and permanent residence outside. And if you are looking to move to Canada, sometimes, applying from outside is advice, is better. And that being said, somebody that is an average person from overseas, if they have no status and no connections in Canada, actually coming to Canada on a visitor's visa or coming to Canada on a visitor status does not give you any up in terms of the immigration system. So it doesn't help you get through any faster. Being physically here on the ground does not help you get through any faster. You still need to meet the requirements. And when you look at the requirements of the programs, most of them don't have a requirement that you have to be physically inside Canada. Most of them are the requirements that you have to apply from outside Canada, or you should be applying from outside Canada. So you're flexible in terms of applying from inside or outside Canada. So it's a misconception for someone to say, well, okay, you need to be here, you need to come here physically in order for us to apply, right? If somebody's looking to apply for you or sponsor you're working in Canada or sponsor your, like if you have family members that are looking to sponsor you, whatnot, these processes can be facilitated from outside Canada, okay? Now, in terms of job opportunities and looking for certain job opportunities in Canada, you should be looking for job opportunities while you're outside Canada. I would say that to look for job opportunities inside Canada, you run the risk of running into employers that may be well versed in the system and they may just want to take advantage, right? So I think that is one of the biggest problems in the field right now. You have a lot of employers that they fully know of the requirements for persons to work in Canada, and they want to circumvent the laws. They want to make it easier for themselves and their business. And they want to, encourage people to do wrong, basically. They want to have them, work in Canada under the table. When we say under the table, we're talking about, just paying some person cash to work in Canada. Some employers can present misleading opportunities. Like you could have a conversation with an employer from outside Canada, and they could say, well, come to Canada. You could come to Canada on your visitor visa, and we could start your paperwork. And then they could say, well, when you get to Canada, they could say, well, okay, now you're in Canada, I could just start you on a payroll, but then I'm going to file your papers for you as soon as, next week. And then it turns into 2 weeks, and then it turns into 3 weeks, and then it turns into a month, and it goes on and on. So it's really important to be aware of employers who want to take advantage, and also make sure that you always have the appropriate paperwork before you travel to Canada. So in order to travel to Canada, you're going to need some kind of visitor visa, you're going to need some ETA. You should be applying for study permit or work permit from outside Canada anyway. The idea is that from the time you land in Canada and you pass the port of entry, you have your authorization to do whatever activity you need. So if you need to study, you have your authorization to study. If you need to work, you have your authorization to work. And, you just can't move to Canada by way of a promise, from an employer or a promise from a recruiter. You want to make sure that you have that appropriate paperwork. And for somebody to tell you, well, come to Canada and then we'll apply for you is a misconception, because most of these processes in terms of work permit processes and so on are facilitated outside Canada. even for the employer to do their portion, it does not require the temporary worker to be physically there in Canada at that time in order for the employer to submit like a labor market impact assessment, or for the employer to do their part to validate your job offer before the government. So it's important to note that you want to make sure that employers are not taking advantage. And sometimes employers have their own personal reasons as to why they would not want to go the extra mile in terms of validating your job offer through the government. Sometimes it may be a case of, finances, the employers, they usually have to pay a lot of money in order to get that process done. It could be for the chances of just, paying the person cash because they don't want to pay that individual the taxes that are required by the government. So they may be evading the authorities with respect to taxes. And I must state that when there is an issue with employment and a person working illegally or being taken advantage of by the employer, I would say that the brush that the employer is painted with, is a little bit less dramatic than the temporary worker itself. So to be working for an employer or being engaged in any kind of negotiation with an employer where, it goes against the law in the sense that you're beginning to work or you're beginning to do prescribed activities that constitute work, like usually it's the temporary worker, the person, the foreign national that gets the brunt, that gets the sticky end of the stick, right? So in the sense that once you're caught by the Canadian authorities, and they come down on you, they're not going to come down on you in the context of the employer. It's going to be that person's responsibility to know the Canadian rules and laws and be able to actually follow the rules. So they're usually not lenient with respect to the worker itself. The employers sometimes just get a slap on the wrist, and that is enough. Now, in terms of persons working in Canada, a big part of it, as I would mention yesterday, and I keep reiterating, is to make sure that you have the appropriate work authorization or the appropriate work permit. So it's a rumor or it's really flawed and false if someone tells you that you could work in Canada without a work permit. There's some prescribed circumstances where you're exempt from having a work permit. So for example, religious workers, if you're a performing artist, if you're athlete or coach. But what makes these jobs very unique and why they don't need a work permit is because they're not entering into the Canadian labor market. They're not competing with Canadians for jobs. They're providing a specific service and need that is prescribed as unique. And they're doing that particular activity for a short duration of time, and then they're leaving, right? They're not actually actively involved in the labor market where they're competing with Canadians. So that's one of the indications that you would know whether a position would need a work permit or not. And you could always validate that information on the IRCC website. So on www.canada.ca, you could validate whether the job position that you're looking for, whether the activity you're looking to undertake in Canada needs a work permit or not. Now, generally, as I said, you're going to need a work permit that is going to require a job offer. And we call it a valid job offer, or we call it arranged employment. And that arranged employment is usually supported by an LMIA or is LMIA exempt. And when we say LMIA, we're talking about the labor market impact assessment. Now, one of the biggest myths is that a job offer is a letter provided by the employer. A job offer is not simply just a letter that is provided by the employer. So there are many persons that would say, hey, like I talked to an employer, they're willing to give me a letter. They're willing to give me what I need. And when I ask, well, what are they willing to give? And they say, well, a letter, they're willing to give a contract. A job offer, a valid job offer is more than that. So even we're talking about legitimate ways to come to Canada and we're talking about a valid job offer, the LMIA comes up, but I don't think that persons really understand what an LMIA means and what the employer has to do. I think that some employers say, well, I don't need to apply for an LMIA, or an LMIA is not needed in this position. But most times you do need that LMIA, you do need that job offer that is validated by the Canadian government. And it's really important to really understand from a worker's perspective or from an applicant or candidate's perspective that is looking to come to Canada, not only to understand your part of the process where you're applying for the work permit, but understanding what the employers need to do, because it would put you in a position to ask the employers the correct questions with respect to what they're willing to do and with respect to what their commitments are. So there's many places in Canada, like when they say that Canada needs workers, when they say that Canada is underpopulated, yes, there is some truth to it in the fact that we do need workers, but we also have to remember that workers, we have some areas that are really concentrated. So we have some heavily concentrated areas in Canada, like the Montreals, we have the Torontos, we have the Vancouvers, which are the metropolitan cities that are very concentrated. We have a high number of immigrants. We have a high population in those areas. And when you're looking at seeing certain things on the internet that may be put out by the Canadian government, they're usually saying, well, yes, Canada needs a certain amount of thousands of workers over the next couple of years, or yes, we need a certain amount of immigrants. But they're talking about those immigrants within those prescribed programs that we mentioned, right? So they're not talking about anything outside of that. So it's going to be very highly unusual for the government to say, well, we need workers and we're making LMIA exempt for everyone. They're not going to do that because, as I would have mentioned on more than one occasion, the government is very protective over the Canadian labor market, and they want to make sure that the Canadian labor market has enough jobs for Canadians and permanent residents that are already here. So they're never going to open the floodgates, just to have persons come in. They want to push a permanent resident agenda. They would rather have persons come permanently and settle in Canada permanently, because retention seems to be an ongoing issue. And they want to make sure that these positions are filled permanently. And when we're talking about Canada, Canada is a really big country. And when they're talking about job vacancies and so on, you may want to look in rural areas, that are not as concentrated. So you would find that an employer in a highly concentrated area would have more people to choose from. You could face more employer abuses in those areas. And you find that employers that are usually probably further out in places that are, not as densely populated, are more willing to apply for certain paperwork for the workers because they really need those persons. So persons are not moving to those places. So when you see that Canada needs people and Canada wants people, they're usually wanting people in particular regions. And that has been a problem that the government has been trying to fix for a long time, in terms of trying to get people moved to certain places in Canada that are more rural and are more remote, where they would want, to have these people come and stay and settle, right? So as I was saying, it's important for persons to understand, from the Canadian employer's perspective, what they need to do when they're applying for that LMIA. Because one of the biggest misconceptions or myth is that, the employers may try to say, oh, it's just a simple form of paperwork or it's not needed. Really and truly, the Canadian employer, they have to usually pay legal fees for these processes. And the legal fees sometimes start at like around probably 8,000 Canadian and up, just for the processing of the LMIA, just preparing it. And then for the government, they have to pay the government fees, which run them around like 1,000 Canadian dollars, that they just have to give the government. And when they basically pay the government is per position. So if they want to hire 10 people, they're looking at 10,000 Canadian dollars. And these fees cannot be paid by the foreign worker. They're only paid by the Canadian employer, and it's illegal for the Canadian employer to, charge the foreign worker these fees. Now, in terms of the actual LMIA process, like what the Canadian employers are paying for and what they have to show the government, they have to show the government that they could fulfill the terms of that job offer. So they have to show the government that they're providing a good service to Canada, that their business is making enough to cover your salary and to cover the workers' salaries that are already working in that business. They have to show the government that the job that they're offering you is consistent with the needs of the business, okay? And I think that the LMIA process, puts in place certain standards, to kind of protect the worker in some areas, right? It protects the worker. They have to show that the job offer that they're giving you is genuine, and they have to show all their business legitimacy documents, all their payroll documents, what their income is from the Canada Revenue Agency. So they have to show what the business makes and then they basically calculate and show that they can pay your salary, and they have to show that they're capable of remaining in business for the duration of time that they're offering you that job. So like if they're offering you the job for 2 years, they should be showing the government that they are willing to stay in business for that 2-year period. And as I said, that your employment is consistent with the needs of the business. So your employment has to be directly related to the business. They have to recruit, they have to show the position, they have to advertise the position all over Canada, for a stipulated period of time, and give Canadians and permanent residents the chance to apply. And there are certain wage requirements. So I think that this is the part that the Canadian employers sometimes are running from. The government stipulates that they're paying a fair wage. So in terms of when we're talking about scams, like usually if you find an employer and the employer is offering you a job and the wage might be low, sometimes the employer might say, well, okay, we don't need to apply for LMIA, I could just pay you cash. And one of the reasons for that is that when they apply for the actual LMIA process, the wage is under review, and they have to pay the worker, they would have to pay you a wage that is a competitive wage. So for starters, they can't pay you a wage that is less than any worker that is working in that same position with the same skills. They have to pay you at the same level of those workers, and they have to pay you at what we will call the prevailing wage or the median wage for that occupation. So on the Job Bank, which I talked about yesterday, Job Bank, which is the main national site that you look for jobs, there is a wage link that you could go in and you could put any occupation on that link. And in terms of the occupations, the wages for the occupations are going to come up. And the wages are classified as low, median, and high. And employers can't give you a low wage. They have to give you a wage that is median. And if there are other Canadians and permanent residents working alongside you in that position, the government forces them to offer you a wage that is competitive. So an employer might want to be evasive, or they might want to kind of shy away from doing the LMIA because of the wage requirements. So they can't pay a temporary worker less and have the temporary worker do more. The government forces them. So that is a deterrent for a lot of employers, because they may not want to pay the competitive wage. So that is something to look out for. And it's always good that when you're looking for jobs in Canada, you could pull up, the Job Bank, you could look at that position on the internet, you could look at the wages and you could compare the wages, so that when you're going to your interviews, you have an idea as to what wage you should be paid for that particular position, right? Because they automatically assume that because you're a foreign national, you're going to accept a lower wage, but they know that the government is going to force them to offer a higher wage. So you want to make sure that you have the information before actually approaching employers, or before undergoing any kind of agreement with employers. Now, in terms of the LMIA exempt work permits that are also employer specific. So you have work permits that are, you need an LMIA, which is that whole process. And then you have work permits that are LMIA exempt. Now, just because the work permit is LMIA exempt, if it's employer specific, it does not mean that they're exempt from being vetted by the government or being examined or assessed. So yes, they don't have to advertise the position all over Canada, but they do have to show that the position that they're offering you is for significant economic, cultural, social, and reciprocal benefits for Canadians. So when we're talking about reciprocal, we're talking about positions and jobs that Canadians would benefit from in other countries as well. So in terms of LMIA exemption, usually they pay high wages to begin with. So if you're looking at jobs in those categories, you're looking at jobs that are really impactful on the Canadian economy, and they usually are high wage positions. Now, even though they're LMIA exempt, it doesn't mean that the employers are exempt from the assessment from the government. They still have to give full disclosure. They still have to give the government the necessary job contracts. They still have to give the government a list, the contract outlining your duties and responsibilities. And they still have to give the government the wages. So there's no requirement for them to offer you the same wage that they're paying Canadians, but it's usually a high wage, right? So the government can question it. they're usually offering a wage that is consistent with your qualifications and is consistent with your skills and your work experience, and they have to give all that information to the government, okay? And they have to disclose any benefits and so on. Now, why this is really important is that it's important to note that workers, are only supposed to undertake the job duties and responsibilities that's stipulated on their employment contract. So when an employer applies for an LMIA exemption, or they apply for an LMIA, that contract is recorded in the government system, and you're only supposed to do the jobs and duties and responsibilities stipulated in your contract. So a lot of employers don't like that specifically, because when you're hired, they say, well, you only need to do A, B, and C, and D. And then when you're in the position, they say, well, you need to do all these other stuff. You need to make sure that you're doing this. They have a lot of duties that are added on. They could actually get into trouble for doing this when they apply for an LMIA, or when they apply for an LMIA exempt position, LMIA exempt position for that worker. Because once the government has approved, the employer to hire the foreign worker, the job duties and responsibilities are approved as well. And you should be only doing what is in your contract. So if the government were to find out that you're doing more than that, not less, but if you're doing more, the employers could get into trouble. Similarly with the wages, if the government were to find out that they're paying you, that they offered you the position at a particular wage, and then they reduce that wage, the employers could get into big trouble. So employers sometimes are a little evasive. They don't want to, go the extra mile, because they don't want to be monitored. Sometimes they don't want the surveillance, right? So this is why you want to have conversations, open and honest conversations with employers, even before coming to Canada, so that you're not stuck in a position where they're trying to force you to do something that you're not supposed to do, or they're taking advantage because your lack of knowledge, right? So they have to be offering you, in terms of the job duties and so on, you only should be doing what is on your contract. And a lot of the employers that have applied for LMIAs and are LMIA exempt, they are monitored. So the government has inspections, and they could be inspected randomly, or if somebody reports them, if they receive a poison pin letter, or they got information, a tip from a whistleblower, or a company was, had past compliance issues, employers could be monitored. And if they're violating by giving the workers a lesser wage than what they agreed on the contract, and when they apply for the LMIA or the LMIA exemption, or if it's a case where the worker is doing more duties than was initially put in the contract, the employers could get into a lot of trouble. So they're monitored really heavily, and the government takes it very seriously, and they could be fined. So they could be fined sometimes millions of dollars, depending on the size of their businesses and how many employees they have. And sometimes they can be banned from hiring temporary workers altogether. So another type situation that you want to be aware of are employers that are banned, right? So you want to make sure that you're, at least once you're in talks with an employer, and the deal seems too good to be true, you want to make sure that you're checking them on the web. There is a list of non-compliant. If you were to just Google non-compliant employers in Canada, a full list will come up as the employers that are permanently banned, that are ineligible to hire temporary workers. Like, the government takes it very seriously, and they take their transparency very seriously. So all this information is available at your fingertips, right? You can actually look to see employers who are non-compliant, because like I said, is a real serious situation. And when you go into the non-compliance and you go into the situations, they're usually employers that have been taking advantage of foreign workers, or they're employers that have been paying the foreign workers less wages, and employers that have just been mistreating their employees and having them do more than what was originally said that they need to do. The general belief is that temporary workers are usually a little bit more compliant. They're a little bit more subtle and docile, and they're usually working towards permanent residence. They don't want to jeopardize their permanent residence, so they don't want to speak out against any kind of employer abuses. But it's also important to note that temporary workers are privy to the same laws, and they're subject to the same laws and rules as Canadian citizens and permanent residents. And in an event that, you're working for an employer and the employer, would not take certain actions with respect to Canadians and permanent residents, temporary workers should have the same benefits, right, under the law. So they're not seen differently in the law. They're not seen as any less. They're seen as the same, and it's important to know your rights. So the employment standards in most provinces, in all the provinces, are for temporary workers, and they're also for Canadians and permanent residents. And employers threatening a temporary worker or employer, basically saying that a temporary worker is going to lose their job if they take part in a strike or whatever. If there's a strike going on and you're a temporary worker and you take part in that strike, the employer they shouldn't take any actions against you. They shouldn't, you shouldn't be penalized, you shouldn't lose your job. All these things employers could get into a lot of trouble for, and they are fined and banned when the government finds out that they're being involved in these type of practices. Now, it's also important to note that you're not required to be physically present in Canada in order to search for jobs or apply for the work permit process. So that is a common myth that we have. Usually we have recruiters, and we have employers and companies saying, well, you need to come to Canada in order to begin working, in order to, apply for your work permit. Most of the work permit processes are facilitated from outside Canada. So you usually have to apply for them from outside Canada. It's only sometimes the government will have certain temporary policies that if a worker is in Canada and the employer has applied for the LMIA or the LMIA exemption and it was approved, in order for the worker don't have to necessarily leave Canada like how they usually would and apply from outside Canada, because it would be a hassle to leave Canada. It would be a burden to uproot and leave and just to come back to get the work permit. So as a result of that, the government allows people to apply from inside Canada. They're allowing visitors to apply from inside Canada, but that is just a temporary measure. But the normal rule is that you apply from outside Canada. So no one should tell you that you have to physically come to Canada in order to apply for your work permit. It's a process that should be done outside Canada. Even the employer's part in terms of the LMIA or the LMIA exemption, what the employer needs to do, that process could be done with you outside Canada, and your work permit process can be done with you outside Canada as well. Now, the next thing is that sometimes some recruiters and employers sometimes pitch to applicants that they are required to pay fees. So job applicants, it's important to know that job applicants are not required to pay recruiters or Canadian companies any kind of fee in order to obtain employment in Canada. That is illegal. This is illegal. And it is a red flag in the sense that if there's an employer that is saying, well, okay, you need to pay me a certain amount, or you need to pay for this process, or you need to pay for this part of the process, like that is illegal. Right? So they should not be charging anytime you're in discussions with a recruiter or a Canadian company and they're actually charging you for jobs in Canada. That in itself is a red flag. So I know that there are a lot of different opportunities going around, circulating on social media, and they would prompt you, they would say, oh, well, you need to pay, to have this information. Like they shouldn't be charging you, period. Like if they have information for you, it should be given free of cost. In terms of the recruiters that are matching you with jobs and so on, the Canadian companies pay the recruiters, but the foreign worker never pays. They don't pay the recruiters. The foreign worker just basically applies for the work permit. So after they have obtained the approval from the government, the employer has obtained that approval and obtained that job offer number, the employer usually gives the worker that approval, that LMIA approval or that job offer number, and the worker uses that number to apply for their work permit. So you could apply for your own work permit, which is apart from that stage, is apart from the employer. You just need to have that approved LMIA, that job offer number. You could pay for your own work permit directly to immigration, and you could pay the processing fees for your work permit directly to immigration. And the processing fees for work permit are going to be like $155, and for open work permits is like $255. But it's not going to be like thousands of dollars like what employers would pay for an LMIA or what they would pay to recruiters. So if you do find an employer that is saying, well, okay, I applied for your LMIA, so now you have to pay me this amount of money in order to get your work permit, like that is false. Like they should be giving you the LMIA, which should have your name on it, or the job offer number, and the paperwork that has your name on it, so that when the work permit is generated, it has your name and your information on it. They shouldn't be charging you for that document. So there's a lot going around, a lot of talk going around about employers actually asking for money for LMIAs and job offers, and they're not supposed to do that. Okay. Are there any questions at this time? I'm going to move on to students. So I'm thinking not. Okay. So in terms of students, there are a fair share of there is a fair share of myths and so on that circulate around students as well, on the Canadian system, in the Canadian immigration system. Now you find that in terms of students, the idea is that a student is applying for their study permit legally, and they're maintaining their student status in Canada. And there's a lot of talk around students being able to work, but there's some rules that students need to understand with respect to their ability to work. So the first myth that goes around is that, you know, students could work just as much time as they can study. Okay. Now there is a temporary policy that is in place right now that is allowing some students to work full-time, but when they apply for their study permit matters. So if any student that applied for their study permit before October 7th, 2022, they're allowed to work full-time. But any student that would have applied for their study permit after that, after October 7th, 2022, wouldn't be able to work full-time while they're studying. They're not able to work full-time. So that is a misconception, you know, that has been floating around. Persons have been applying for their study permits in order to take advantage of working. And remember that when you're a student in Canada, you know, the first and foremost, your status is a student. So they don't owe it to an individual to have them work full-time, right? Like your main focus is a student. And the idea is that if you're coming as a student, you should be studying more than you're working. And this is why they have stipulations on the working. The reason why they have that policy that allows some people to apply to work full-time has to do with the challenges that happened during COVID, with respect to persons losing their job, not being able to pay for schools and so on. And then also what is a little bit challenging as well is the fact that the labor market. So it's said that the labor market, you know, has some shortages. They have some skill and job shortages. So in those type circumstances, the government will pull from within, and students are authorized to work with their study permits. And so they give the students that opportunity. But generally, students are only required to work up to 20 hours a week when they're in their academic session. So that means when school is in session and they're registered full-time. And if they could work more than that, it would be stipulated in a particular policy with dates. Okay. So students can work full-time when they're on their regular scheduled breaks. And full-time for immigration is classified as anything over 30 hours per week. So anything that is under 30 hours per week is considered part-time, and anything that is over 30 hours a week is considered full-time. But for students, in terms of working part-time in their academic sessions, they could only work to 20 hours a week, up to 20 hours a week. So it's really important for students also to understand that they have to maintain their full-time enrollment during their studies in order to take advantage of working in Canada. So one of the biggest myths is that, you know, a student could come to Canada, apply for study permit, and then just work the whole time. Like if you're not registered in school full-time, if you're not actively engaged in your studies, it affects your ability to work. So your ability to work as a student, whether full-time or part-time, is affected by your enrollment status at the institution. So you have to maintain a full-time enrollment in order to take advantage of working either part-time or working full-time during scheduled breaks. That is a requirement. Usually for most students that are registered full-time, they could only actually be part-time in their last year of academic studies, but they should be full-time in every other year, right? Now, in terms of students not studying, sometimes the government really understands that there's some prescribed circumstances that would warrant a student to, not study for a certain period of time. Some people have certain challenges, with their health or family members or pregnancies, etc. Students can obtain what we call an authorized leave, but they're only allowed to leave their studies for up to 150 days. That is what 150 days. Now, when they're talking about unauthorized leave, they're talking about getting the necessary documentation from the school to say that the leave is authorized. So an individual can't just not be in school or just drop out of school. So some people think that they're in Canada, they're students, they could just not be in school. They could just come and just not be in school. It affects their ability to do anything else in immigration. Like if they want to apply for permanent residence or if they want to apply for, like a work permit, your immigration history follows you. So they can be on an authorized leave with the proper documentation from the institution for up to 150 days. And if they are going to be on leave for longer than that, they need to change their status. They need to change their status from that student status. So they need to change their status to a visitor, or they would need to leave Canada in order to maintain, being in good favor with immigration. If they stay and they're not studying, they're violating their study permit. So they're non-compliant. It runs into inadmissibility, and it could run into that particular client losing their status. So it's very important that they understand about the authorized leaves and the circumstances around that authorized leave. So it's a misconception that students could just not study, could be here and not study, okay? Now, the next myth is that students are required to find a job related to their field of study in order to qualify for permanent residence. Now, firstly, it is a misconception that a student could use their jobs that they're working in while they're students. So if a student is working 20 hours a week during the time that they're studying and they're working full-time during their schedule breaks, they cannot use that work experience for permanent residence. So when they're a student and they're working as a student, they can't use that particular work experience while they're a student to add to their permanent residence. But after they have completed their studies, they could use that period of working to contribute to their permanent residence. Now, the thing about students is that they're not required to find a job that is related to their field of study. So if they studied engineering and they decide that in terms of career, they want to change careers and they want to do human resources and they get a job in human resources and they want to use their human resources experience to apply for permanent residence, then they could definitely do that. So there's no obligation that students have to find a job that is related in their field. So that is definitely a myth. Now, what students need to find is what we call a professional job. So for permanent residence, with respect to students, the idea is not that, they find a particular job in their field, but the idea is that the level of job that they find is really important. So we classify our jobs in tiers. We have a NOC system, which is called a National Occupational Classification System, where it has all the jobs that you could find in Canada on a Canadian standard. So when anybody's applying, to come to Canada permanently and there's a job requirement or there's a requirement for experience, the first step is to look into that system to see if the job that you're doing outside is equivalent on a Canadian standard, like what the equivalence is on the Canadian standard. So jobs overseas are going to have different types of job titles, and sometimes they have different types of duties. But the job system that we use, it has over 50,000 different types of jobs. So more than likely, you should be able to find your job or something that's close to your job in that system. And you have different tier levels. So the tier levels are organized based on the education and based on the job requirements. So for students, they would need to find a professional job. And when we say professional, we're looking at tier levels of 0, 1, 2, and 3. And what makes these jobs unique and what makes them different from jobs from tier levels 4, 5, or 6, because our tier levels run from 0 to 6, are that these jobs that are considered professional usually require some kind of post-secondary education. So usually they would need some kind of post-secondary education, whether it's a diploma, whether it's a certificate, whether it's a bachelor's, master's. You're usually looking at a job with a education requirement. So for somebody to say, oh, you could be a student in Canada, and then once you're done studying, you could just get any job in Canada and then qualify for permanent residence, that is a myth and a misconception. The job needs to be at a certain level, and usually one of the indicators are the requirements for that job. So the job should require some kind of post-secondary education. Jobs that are tier level 4, 5, or 6, which are seen as lower tier level jobs, usually they don't require any kind of post-secondary education. They do require on-the-job training. So you would find jobs like customer service representatives, persons working in retail as sales reps and so on, in different types of retail stores. Those types of jobs require on-the-job training. You don't necessarily have to have any kind of formal post-secondary education, and therefore those jobs are not going to be a good fit for permanent residence under express entry. So international students could take any job that they want when they're done school. That is not a myth, but the myth is that any job is going to get you permanent residence under express entry. The job has to be a particular level. Now, one of the next things is that studying in Canada exempts a student from the requirement of taking a language test. So a big part of a student transitioning to permanent residence, especially when they're applying under the economic stream, if they're applying under like humanitarian or they're applying under family sponsorship, they don't need to do the language test. But if they're applying under the economic streams, which would be express entry or provincial nominee, or any of those economic streams that we would have discussed yesterday, students are going to need to do a language test. So some students that are studying in Canada may say, well, I'm already studying in Canada, I'm getting my education in English or sometimes French. Why do I need to do a language test? So the language test has to do with competitiveness and competence in terms of your ability to speak language, to speak English. So it's equated with, you know, the higher your language scores, the more competitive you are. So studying in Canada does not exempt somebody from taking the language test. Studying in Canada does not exempt any person from meeting the permanent resident requirements that you would have to meet, say you're outside Canada. It's all the same. So just because if you're studying in Canada, you may be more competitive because you have more to add to your permanent residence profile, in the sense that you would have Canadian studies that will give you points. You will have more than likely Canadian work that would give you points, but it doesn't exempt you from any of the other criteria that you would have to, like in terms of doing the language test or doing your medical examinations or getting your police certificates from everywhere that you lived when you were 6 months, where you lived 6 months or more. You still need to meet all the criteria like everybody else, and studying in Canada does not necessarily give you a leg up from not meeting that criteria. Now, the next myth is that students can't apply for permanent residence while they're holding student status. So if a student, for example, a mature student, you know, that has been in Barbados or somewhere else in the world, and they have been working, you know, most of their life, and they have, you know, that education and they have that work experience, and then they move to Canada as a student. And while they're studying, they're exploring permanent residence options. Nothing is stopping them from doing both simultaneously. So our immigration laws permit persons to apply for permanent residence and temporary residence at the same time. We look at them as two intentions, and we look at them as having a dual intention. So we don't mix the permanent and the temporary. So how you advise when you're looking for opportunities in Canada, how you're advised for temporary would not be how you're advised for permanent, because the requirements for both programs are separate. But if you are a temporary resident, like if you are a student and you are eligible for permanent residence while you're on your student status, you can definitely meet the requirements for, and you meet the requirements for that particular specific PR program, you could definitely apply for permanent residence. That would be amazing. And if you were to get through with permanent residence and you were to finalize the process and you become a permanent resident, that nullifies your study permit. So it would mean that as a permanent resident, you're not required to need a study permit or work permit. You could work and study without authorization and be back and forth, you know, between Canada and your home country. And yeah, you could actually, you know, be a permanent resident. So, and for permanent residents, there are certain benefits, you know, if you become a permanent resident, in the sense that you could then qualify for, you know, instead of paying international fees, then you could qualify for paying, you know, permanent resident fees in terms of your tuitions and so on, which is a lot cheaper. So there's nothing stopping a student from applying for permanent residence while they're holding that study permit status. Now, in terms of permanent residence and debunking the myths around permanent residence. So permanent residence is the next one, is a big one, because there are a lot of different myths associated with applying for permanent residence. So as I said, permanent residence is separate from temporary. We look at them as two different programs. So in immigration, what is permanent is permanent, and what is temporary is temporary. And we usually don't mix both. So the advice that you get for temporary is not going to be the same thing for permanent, right? The type of application process that you undergo when you're looking to come to Canada temporarily is not the same as when you are applying permanently. Okay. Now, one of the things that, you know, we would have spoken about in terms of temporary residence is not having to physically move to Canada in order to get temporary residence. Permanent residence is similar in the sense that you don't necessarily have to be physically in Canada to qualify or apply for permanent residence directly. Okay. So for some students, for example, you know, you could, if there's a person that was a student and then they were a worker and now they want to apply for permanent residence under, like, for example, express entry, they could apply from express entry from anywhere. So they could apply from, if they're in Canada at the same time, or if they happen to, you know, not have their status in Canada anymore, they could move to wherever they need to move to back home, and they could apply for permanent residence from outside Canada. Okay. So it's a misconception or myth that you have to physically move to Canada in order to qualify for permanent residence directly. There are programs that you could apply for outside Canada. Now, I'm not saying that if you're applying from inside Canada, you wouldn't be more competitive. But when we're talking about inside Canada, we're talking about somebody that is intertwined with Canada in the sense that they have some kind of authorization in Canada. So we're talking about workers in Canada, persons with a work permit already in Canada, persons with a study permit already in Canada. And we're not talking about a person that is just physically in Canada. So someone that basically is a visitor and just moved to Canada, you know, as a visitor in order to apply for permanent residence. There's no need, right? Any program that you could assess inside Canada, you could assess outside Canada, because permanent residence is not tied to being in Canada at that time when you're applying, okay? There's some programs that you need to be there for, like, for example, spouses and so on. If you're claiming that you want to be with your spouse, you know, there is a program where if you're applying under the spousal category, you're with your spouse in Canada, you're residing in Canada with your spouse. But even for spouses, there is a stream where you can apply, you know, for spousal sponsorship as outside, right? So there's never ever a hard and fast rule where you need to be physically inside Canada in order to qualify for PR. So there's some programs, for example, Express Entry, where we have the 3 classes: the Federal Skilled Worker, we have the Canadian Experience class, we have the Federal Skilled Trades, which is for tradespersons. All these programs could be assessed from outside Canada, okay? And then you have the provincial nominee programs as well that you could apply from outside Canada. And one of the requirements under the provincial nominee program is that depending on where the province that you're gonna settle in, you're gonna show that you have an intent to actually live in that province, right? So you're gonna, sometimes for some provincial nominee programs, there's an intent that you sign, like a form that you sign, kind of attesting and promising to stay in that province. So they want to see that you're gonna live in that province, you're gonna move to that province. And it doesn't mean that you can't apply from outside, right? You don't have to be physically in that province at that time. It's just that when you get your permanent residence, you're going to be moving directly to that province. Now, the caregiver programs also facilitate persons to apply from outside Canada. Persons are given, work permit approval and their visa, they travel to Canada, they get their work permits, and they apply for permanent residence at the same time. And then after the 2 years, then they get their permanent residence. So those programs also facilitate applying from outside Canada. And then the immigration pilots that we would have also allow persons to apply from outside Canada. So, I mean, the thing is that some people like to come to Canada to physically connect with employers and so on, and that is okay, but you just have to make sure that you're not being taken advantage of in that process, like what we discussed before. But any of the permanent resident programs that you would want to apply for could be, applied for outside Canada. Even if you're applying under like express entry or for any of these programs, and an employer is offering you a job, because we have employers that could offer you a job to support your work permit, and then you have employers that could offer you a job that comes with an LMIA in order to support your permanent residence. So sometimes we have some permanent residence, like say some permanent residence programs, like say express entry, that in those programs, if you have a job offer from an employer, it makes you more competitive. So it gives you more points. So if an employer is supporting your application for permanent residence by going through the LMIA process and offering you that job, they usually have to show that they're going to offer you that job for at least 1 year after you have gotten your permanent residence. And that whole entire process could be done from outside Canada. So even though you're applying for permanent residence, there's no requirement for you to be in Canada. Of course, you can decide that you want to come to Canada before and get the work permit and work, or you could wait till you become a permanent resident and then come to Canada and work as a permanent resident. So there's no, as I said, no requirement to do the process from inside Canada, right? So there's some people that come to Canada as visitors and then they stay and they get into trouble by working illegally or just overstaying their time. And there's no need for that because you could qualify from outside Canada. Now, I'm not saying that being outside Canada doesn't come without its challenges, depending on the type of permanent residence programs you're applying for, especially the economic streams. Most of the time, you have to complete a language test, which are the two main language tests that we use for immigration are IELTS and CELPIP. And unfortunately, these tests aren't offered in Barbados, right? They aren't offered in Barbados. So for any company to, kind of pitch you and say, well, you could do these tests from where you are. Sometimes to take these tests requires you to travel. Okay, so the IELTS and CELPIP, I know that for sure that they're offered in the US, they're offered in the same Canada, they're offered in the UK, several other countries. I think they're offered in Trinidad, but they're not offered in Barbados. So usually in terms of being outside Canada, you usually have to travel to meet those requirements in terms of doing that IELTS test or that CELPIP test. You may have to travel for that. The next thing is that persons that are coming under the trades, persons that are tradespersons. So we're talking about persons that are like plumbers, persons that are carpenters. All these trades are licensed in Canada under certain provincial trade authorities. And one of the challenges when you're looking to apply as a tradesperson is that sometimes part of your application process requires you to undertake certain exams and apprenticeships, and those exams and apprenticeships would be done in Canada. So for somebody coming, from Barbados, it might not be an issue, because you don't need a visa. So you just, you apply for your ETA, you get it quickly, you go to Canada, you basically do your exams. But for apprenticeship, it's a little bit more complex. You would need to apply for study permit and also get work authorization in order to complete your apprenticeships. But the challenge is that you can't do the exams outside Canada. Usually you have to be in Canada. And I think that in terms of doing your exams, it could be facilitated on your visitor status, where, like sometimes exams are a couple of days or a week in order to get your trade certificate to practice that trade in that province and use that certificate to show that for permanent residence, you could be more competitive, meaning that you could get more points, right? So depending on the province, depending on if you're applying under the provincial programs or express entry, you may need to get that trade certificate or job offer that makes you more competitive. And for the trade certificates, especially, you may need to travel to Canada in order to get certified. But again, it doesn't require like a lengthy stay. So it doesn't require you to like overstay your authorization or anything. It's just facilitating your exams and whatever you need to transition in order to get that certificate. And then you could definitely leave and continue the permanent resident process from outside Canada. Now, in terms of
Chantal, before you move on, just a question for you. You spoke about students and their ability to work earlier. Would you be able to share any information in terms of them becoming tax compliant or filing taxes or anything related to that process?
Oh, no, definitely not. So my area of expertise is immigration, and I stick to that. So if a person wants to know about taxes, they should seek an accountant. Okay. So I don't know, with respect, I'm not an expert with taxes and so on. So I can't advise on that or share anything about that. They would have to seek an accountant. I could only really talk about immigration, which is my area. Okay. Thank you. All right. So in terms of applying under the economic streams, so the economic streams, you have skilled workers and business classes. No, there's a misconception that when you're applying, there's no need to undertake the language test, the same language test that we spoke about. So some persons believe that even though they have been educated in English or they have lived in English-speaking countries all their lives, that they could just, qualify for these programs without taking a language test. So usually if you're applying for a program and it has a language requirement, they're going to validate your language with a language test. Okay, like that is the only way. So you would have to do the language test. And unfortunately, if the language test is not in Barbados, you're going to have to travel to do the language test to meet that requirement. Because a lot of these programs, you actively cannot apply without fulfilling the requirements, right? Like the system asks you for certain codes and certain dates and so on that you would get on your language test results. And you need those dates to input in the system to make sure that, it takes your language results and so on. So you can't get out of doing the language test, okay? Now, in terms of other areas of permanent residence, like, yesterday we spoke about sponsorships and sponsoring. So it is a misconception that you could be sponsored by any family member, and I think I would have mentioned this yesterday, that you could be sponsored by any family member or any relative. You cannot be sponsored by any family member. It has to be, as I said, your spouses, your common law partners, conjugal partners, dependent children. You could sponsor your parents and grandparents. You could sponsor your siblings, your nieces, nephews, grandchildren that are orphaned and under the age of 18. And you could sponsor any relative that, if you can prove that as a Canadian or permanent resident, you are alone and there's no existing person that is alive that you could sponsor. Apart from that, you can't be sponsored or settle in Canada just because you have friends that are Canadians and permanent residents. So one of the myths is that, a friend could help you out, by filing something for you or filing some kind of paperwork. It's something that you have to do on your own. So if you are applying for permanent residence and you do qualify, you could add your spouse on that application. You could add your dependent children that are under the age of 22. You cannot add your parents on those type applications. Your parents aren't seen as accompanying. Once you have gotten through with your permanent residence, then you could sponsor your parents in a separate application, but your accompanying family members are seen as your immediate family members, which is like your nuclear family unit, which would be your spouse and your children. Once you're applying for your paperwork, if you're applying to come to Canada temporarily, excuse me, or you're applying to come to Canada permanently, you could add your spouses and your children on your paperwork. but you cannot add your parents. So, excuse me, some persons have a misconception that they could be sponsored or settle in Canada. Excuse me 1 minute.
Sorry, just give Chantal a minute. She will be right back.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that, everyone. So as I was saying, some people have the misconception that you could add your parents can accompany you when you apply for permanent resident or when you apply for temporary residence. But it's only your immediate family members that is seen as your nuclear family unit, which would be your spouses, your children, your spouses and your children that are under the age of 22, that are unmarried and they're not in a common law relationship, or they are over the age of 22 and have been physically or medically dependent on you for their entire lives. Now, in terms of sponsorship, once you become a permanent resident, so one of the misconceptions is that if you're applying, like say if you're applying under the economic streams, some people think that if you're applying, you have to necessarily add your family members, your nuclear family members on the application. You don't necessarily have to add your family members on the application. You have to declare them. So you have to disclose to immigration every single time the absolute truth that you are married or you do have children. Like you can't say you're single if you're married or if you're in a common law relationship. You have to tell the truth, but they would give you the option of, having them, accompany you or non-accompanying, right? That is an option. So you could come alone and then you could apply for sponsorship for your loved ones after after you have settled in Canada. So there's no requirement that you need to apply for everybody at once. You could choose to apply for everybody at once, but if you want to apply under the economic streams and you want to come to Canada and then get settled and then you want to formally sponsor your family members, after that, you could sponsor like your spouse and your children, and you could sponsor your parents and your grandparents. But there's no requirement that you have to have everybody come at the same time. Some people don't want to disrupt their children, in school. Some people want to wait till their children get a little older. It's fine to wait, you just don't wait until they're over the age of 22. You have to do it when they're under the age of 22. So in terms of permanent residence and your choice in terms of moving, you have some flexibility. So it's a myth that you have to apply for everybody at once. Sometimes, when you go to lawyers and consultants, they may encourage you to apply for everybody at once, but sometimes that could only be to kind of pack on the charges, right? Instead of having a single applicant, you're doing paperwork for the entire family. It comes to more money. So you want to be wary of that. You don't have to apply for every single person at once. You could definitely come and then sponsor them later on. Now, another myth or misconception is around the type of relationships that are accepted by immigration, right? So it's a myth for anybody to tell you that you have to be legally married or you have to be legally married. You could only be married, in order to migrate to Canada with your partner. So there is a requirement that if you're looking to migrate to Canada with your partner, you could be legally married or in a common law union or common law relationship, as we would call it. A common law relationship, legally married is pretty simple. It means that your marriage is legal. You have the marriage certificate to support that marriage. in a common law relationship, it's a little bit more complex, in the sense that you must be, cohabitating with that person for at least 12 months. So you're looking at living with that person for a year, and you're looking at residing with that person for a year, and being able to prove that you have been residing with that person for the year, and then also that you have been, that you are in a genuine relationship with that person. So you're in a relationship that is underpinned with emotional dependencies, financial dependencies, a relationship that's you have that interdependent connection. You're basically genuinely, in love with that person. So in terms of coming to Canada temporarily as a student or as a worker, or coming to Canada permanently, you would have to prove your relationship status. If you're claiming that you're married, you have to have the documentation to support that. If you're claiming that you're in a common law relationship, you have to have the documentation to support that. And for common law relationships, I think that the documentation is a lot more complex, in the sense that you have to show that you're living together, and then also that you're in a genuine relationship. So in terms of the living together, you're looking at documents again, like having the same address on your driver's license. You're looking at having like joint bank accounts, having, like if you're renting, you're leasing, having both persons on lease, showing like different types of utility bills and different types of bills that are coming to the house with both persons' names on it. You're basically proving documentation across that 12-month period, not every single month, but across that 12-month period, that you're actually living together for that time. Now, immigration does not recognize boyfriend-girlfriend type relationships, which are very common in other places. For immigration, it's either you're in a common law relationship or you're married, and nothing else, nothing else matters for immigration. So the thing is that a lot of people would be common law, they would be physically living together, but they wouldn't be able to prove it. So that is just as much as not living together. So if you're going to claim that you're living together, and you're immigrating based on your common law union, and you're immigrating as like a student and a worker, you want your common law partner to be with you, it can't be presented to immigration in the context of a boyfriend-girlfriend type relationship. You have to not only, if you're saying that you're common law, you're living together, it's your paperwork that is going to say that you're common law. So it would matter how you're able to prove it, right? So if you're common law and you've been living together, but you can't prove it, it's just as if you're not living together. So you have to make sure that you're living together. You have to make sure that you're proving it. So sometimes for some people, that would look like living together for years and years, and then getting documentation together for the last year to show that they're at least meeting that 1 year, right? Because some people just live together, but they keep everything the same. Like they keep their address, like their mail coming to their parents' house or their family member's house, and they don't have a paper trail to show that they're living together. So for immigration, that wouldn't work. And for immigration, it's important to note that in Canada, same-sex relationships are recognized. So same-sex common law relationships are recognized and accepted. No, they do accept same-sex relationships in terms of common law unions and marriages, but like it's, everywhere is not like Canada where you could actually get married to your same-sex spouse. So I say common law relationships because it would be more common for same-sex persons in same-sex relationships to be living together as opposed to getting married in other places, right? But same-sex marriages and common law relationships are recognized, and the standard is the same. So you do have to show the same documentation. You do have to show that you're in a loving relationship that has permanence and commitment, and that you're basically in love, and you're basically applying for your spouse or your partner, or if you're coming together as a family unit, you're meeting those definitions. Now, a common myth, what I hear floating around in terms of the immigration systems is that you could marry, you could, like pay to get your paperwork. Like you could enter into a fraudulent relationship and get your paperwork. So I would like to say that you should not enter into a fraudulent relationship. Whether you're marrying someone, you're paying someone to marry, or you're in a common law, you're paying someone to live with them for a year, or you're being with someone that is, like kind of doing you a favor and marrying you, or in a common law union, or lying to the government that you're living together when you're not, for the sole purposes of gaining permanent residence in Canada, because this could lead to some serious ramifications, especially if it turns sour. Now, in terms of being married or in a common law union, especially if for individuals that are already living in Canada, the government is usually very thorough in terms of deciphering if people are in genuine relationships. And in Canada, you've seen persons are, their persons are, sometimes they're called into, if the government has any suspicions, they could be called into interviews. The government could check, to see if you're in a common law relationship. They could ask both persons questions about, their their intimate relationship, about their household, in terms of what is in their household. They could ask very detailed questions. So it's very risky, lying and saying that you're in a common law union when you're not. And in terms of being married is very risky, paying someone or entering into a fraudulent relationship. Because first of all, it's unethical. So any professional that would tell you that that is what you need to do is, that is just completely wrong. And then, as I said, that in the event of it, getting sour or immigration, getting a risk that, that is what you're doing and that is what is happening, you could run the risk of being pulled up for misrepresentation, which means that you're misrepresenting, you're lying, you're omitting facts, or you're outright lying to immigration. And that could lead to that could lead to an individual losing their status, whatever status they have, whether it's temporary, whether they have gotten their permanent resident status already, they could lose it and they could be deported. And in terms of those type of arrangements turning sour, sometimes, you hear of certain situations with persons, being, in a situation, of convenience, and then it turns sour. And while the sponsorship is happening, sometimes the Canadians and permanent residents, have the full power, as you would say, in the sense that they could just call immigration and say, well, I changed my mind, I don't want to do this anymore. They could withdraw the sponsorship, and that person could lose their status and sometimes be deported from Canada. So there's no safety network for the actual foreign national, the actual person that is applying for permanent residence. Once you're applying for somebody to sponsor you, once you're applying for that sponsorship, and the Canadian or permanent resident indicates that they don't want to go ahead with the sponsorship, the government never says, well, hey, you kind of misled this person, you kind of already started the process, so you need to continue. The government is always like, okay, if you don't want to do it anymore, you don't want to do it anymore. So in the event of not entering into a relationship that is genuine, has its risks and has its fair share of problems. So that is something that we usually, warn persons against, because some people, it could turn into a big thing. Of course, if you know of anybody, or you yourself is in a relationship where you're facing any kind of psychological or physical abuse, there is a way that you could, alert the authorities. You could apply for what we call a temporary resident permit, that allows you to get a interim status, until you could get your permanent residence on your own. So that permit would allow you to stay in Canada. It would allow you to work, but you have to show that you're being abused by your spouse. So you have to show that you're facing psychological abuse, you're facing financial abuse, you're facing physical abuse in some aspects. You have to show that, like you're at the whim of your spouse, and that they're abusing you and they're misleading you and they're holding the fact that they're submitting a sponsorship over your head. So individuals can, but you have those type applications are discretionary. They're based on their own. It's a case by case analysis that goes on. They're based on their own merits and they're approved based on the information that you could provide. So in terms of having your documents together to show that you're abused, it's fine. But if you are in a fraudulent relationship and it turns, like I said, sour, and it turns in a situation where the government realizes that it's not genuine and you have misrepresented, it can lead to the loss of status and your deportation. Okay. The next myth is around Canadian citizenship. So some people believe that you could apply for Canadian citizenship automatically without becoming a permanent resident first. That is a misconception. Now, how it works, you can't choose between permanent residence and citizenship. Is a natural hierarchical order. So if you're looking to come to Canada permanently, you're looking at applying for permanent residence. And then there's usually a waiting residency period before you could apply for Canadian citizenship. So you could apply for permanent residence, and then after, if you so decide, you could qualify and apply for Canadian citizenship. There's no program that allows you to skip, as a temporary resident and then straight to Canadian citizenship, right? And there's no program that allows you to, because you're involved with a Canadian spouse or you're married to a Canadian spouse, to just automatically get Canadian citizenship. Even if your spouse is Canadian, they would have to sponsor you. You get permanent residence first, and then you apply for citizenship once you have met the requirements for citizenship. So that is one of the biggest myths that we have around. And then we have a myth that people could gain Canadian citizenship directly through descent, right? If their parents have, if their parents are Canadian citizens, some people believe that they could just automatically become a Canadian citizen. Now, when your parents gain Canadian citizenship matters, and in terms of the process, even to verify that you're Canadian, it involves an application where you have to apply for what we call a proof of Canadian citizenship, to say that you're actually Canadian. So if your parent became a Canadian citizen before you were born, then you could be a Canadian citizen by descent. So it means that you could be a Canadian citizen, but again, to activate that Canadian citizenship, you would need to apply for what we call proof of Canadian citizenship. So as long as your parent was a Canadian before you were born, you should be able to get the Canadian citizenship. It wouldn't be a problem. But it's not like if you're going to be able to move to Canada and just say, well, my dad is Canadian or my mom is Canadian, so I could work, right? It doesn't work that way. You have to actually have the document to show that you are Canadian. Now, I think this is like the same point. No, you cannot, I'm just going to go a little further. You cannot qualify for Canadian citizenship just because you have a parent who's Canadian. So just because you might have a parent that's Canadian, it doesn't mean that you automatically qualify, as I would have said before. There is what we call a first generation limit in place, where, as we know, Canadian citizenship can be passed on, to your children, but there is a first generation limit with respect to natural born Canadians and Canadians that are naturalized. Okay. So if your parent, or if we will say the individual, if the individual became a Canadian citizen by being naturalized in Canada, like applying for permanent residence and then getting their Canadian citizenship, that person could pass on their Canadian citizenship to their children that are born outside Canada for the first generation. That would mean, but that first generation is limited, meaning that if they were to get children that are born outside Canada, they cannot then pass on that citizenship to their children, right? So there is a first generation limit. And you must, in terms of your parents, again, you must be born after your parent become a Canadian citizen in order to get that citizenship by descent. And it could only pass down for certain amount of generations. So if you're born in Canada and you get children that are born outside Canada, you could pass on your citizenship to your children. But those children that are born outside Canada cannot pass on their citizenship to children that they may have outside Canada. in order for their children to be Canadian citizens, they would have to give birth to their children in Canada, or have the other Canadian, have the other parent that is Canadian, apply for citizenship by descent for that particular child, right? Now, of course, if you're a Canadian citizen at any time, you could always sponsor your children. So you could always apply for permanent residence for your children by way of submitting a sponsorship for your children that are under the age of 22, that are not married or not in a common law union. But in terms of passing on Canadian citizenship, you want to be wary that there is a first generation limit, even for persons that are adopted. So if you are a Canadian citizen and you're adopting a child that is overseas, you're looking at applying for permanent residence for that child, or applying for Canadian citizenship. And if you apply for Canadian citizenship for that child, the child is not able to pass on their Canadian citizenship to any children that they may have. So they do have that first generation limit. So you can rest assured that if you become Canadian, you could pass on your citizenship to your children born outside Canada, but they're not gonna be able to pass it on to your grandchildren. So there's a question, Andrew?
Yeah, yes, there is. The question is, if I complete my express entry profile and include my spouse as a common law spouse, can I change or update this if we get married while I am still in the express pool? Or is it best to just wait until after the wedding to complete the express entry profile?
No. Okay, so if you basically if you declared your spouse as common law and you become married, you will have to update it on express entry. So if the system does not, sometimes with the express entry system, what happens is that, certain details are blocked out, like certain details, it does not allow you to change. But if you do receive and what we call an invitation to apply for permanent residence, you do have to let the government know that you're married, and you have to submit the documentation to show that you're married. So you should be informing immigration every stage as to your marital status, right? So if the person decides to go ahead and get married, they should be able to change their relationship status on express entry. But if they're not, once they get that invitation to apply, they have to disclose that they're now married to immigration. Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, in terms of Canadian citizenship, now the next thing to note is that having a Canadian-born child does not automatically qualify an individual for permanent residence or Canadian citizenship or any other status in Canada. Having a Canadian-born child is just that your child is born in Canada. So it means that your child is privy to all the different types of amenities that would be offered to Canadian citizens. They could, get the health care. They could be in Canada. They could study. They could pay domestic fees when they study. They could come and go as they please. They have the unqualified right to be in Canada. But with respect to the parent, there's still a question mark next to their status. They still have to make sure that they're rectifying their status. They're maintaining their status. So the parent is on their own in terms of qualifying for some kind of permanent resident process, or they're looking at submitting some kind of application if they do believe that they have compelling reasons and they have, some kind of, significant need to be in Canada with their child. They could apply for what we discussed yesterday around humanitarian and compassionate. But having a Canadian-born child does not automatically qualify you for permanent residence or any kind of Canadian citizenship or status. There's still a question mark. You still need to be in status. And if you do happen to lose your status and you happen to be in the clutches of CBSA, which is Canada Border Services Control, in the sense that you're in Canada overstaying or you're illegal, and they were to catch up on you and you were to be in a situation where they're looking to deport you, they would definitely deport you with your child, right? And their view is that the child would be able to come back once they're 18 or whenever they want. But with respect to you, you need to address your own status. You need to make sure that you're good in terms within your own status, right? So for persons that do have Canadian-born children, they would want to look in if they want to enjoy the advantages of being in Canada along with their children. They're looking at rectifying their rectifying their status by getting some kind of permanent residence and then obtaining Canadian citizenship on their own. Now, the next myth is that applying through the refugee program is like applying for any other permanent resident program. And we would have touched on this yesterday, but applying through the refugee program is not like applying through any kind of other permanent residence. It is a big deal, it's a huge deal in immigration. They take it very seriously. The eligibility process that they look at is very serious. When you apply for refugee, as I would have mentioned, you know, it's a one-time opportunity in the sense that you could never apply for refugee and then apply for it again. You could only apply for it one time. Even if you decide to change your mind, you decide to withdraw your case, or you decide to, or you lose your case, you know, you could never ever apply for refugee again. It is not immigration and refugees and citizenship where you apply for your work permit or your study permit that processes refugee claims. It is the Immigration and Refugee Board that processes claims from inside Canada, and they're a tribunal, right? So they're the largest quasi-judicial tribunal in Canada. And when you make a refugee hearing, it's an oral hearing. So it's set up like a court where you have to take the stand and you have to give your oral testimony against your country, against the capability of your country to protect you. And the next thing is that if you win your case, as I would have mentioned, if you win your case, your protected person status follows you. It travels parallel and adjacent to your immigration status. So regardless of if you become a permanent resident or you become a Canadian citizen, you know, it follows you, right? So the difference between refugee and getting permanent residence under another stream is that if you were to be a person as a temporary resident, like a student, and then you qualify for an economic stream and you get your permanent residence, it goes that you're a student, and then you become a permanent resident, and then you become a citizen. When you file for refugee, you become a protected person. And you're a protected person. And then if you're a protected person, you are able to then apply for permanent residence and you're able to apply for citizenship, but you always remain a protected person. So if immigration were to find out that you have lied on your refugee claim or you made your refugee claim fraudulently, you know, that interrupts or it puts your protected person status in question. And when you lose your protected person status, you lose everything else. So you lose your citizenship, you lose your PR. So it's not something that was ever intended to be permanent in the first place. So it's very risky in the sense that your status is always tied to your protection, your protected person status. So your immigration status is always tied to your protected person status. And if you lose your protected person status, you lose all your other statuses. And usually you lose it by the government finding out that you made your claim fraudulently, you lied on your claim, or they find out that you have reavailed yourself. So when you make a claim in Canada for refugee, your passport is seized, and usually, you know, is advised that you don't return home. For some people, if a long time has passed and their agent of harm, as you would call it, so if the situation where you claim refugee does not exist anymore, you could be able to travel home. But if you're caught traveling home, you go through the process of going to court again. So they take you to court again to discuss why you're going home. And if they find that, you know, you're abusing the system and your agent of harm is still there and you lied and there's no fear, they would revoke your protected person status and you would lose your PR, you would lose your citizenship, you lose everything. They also take it seriously, you know, being that they seize your passport when you applied for refugee, when somebody that has made a refugee claim in the past or they have protected person status, when they reapply for their passport in terms of their country of origin, their country of nationality, that if the government were to find out, it sends a red flag. So it sends off their alarms. So they seize your passport, and usually the idea is that you could travel anywhere else except from the country, your country of nationality that you claimed refugee against. And if you were to apply for your passport it's kind of like you're reacquiring your nationality. Your intent is to travel back, and they take that very seriously, and that could lead to you losing your protected person status and losing your PR, your permanent residence, or your citizenship. So usually, if you go to a good counsel or a good immigration consultant, they would always advise that that you use other avenues to get your permanent residence as opposed to refugee. And you only use the refugee program if it's a situation where you are genuinely a refugee, you're genuinely fleeing from where you come from. And if we look at it in the context of persons that are coming from war-torn countries, when they are basically running from these countries, while the countries have upheavals and they have wars and so on, they actually don't want to return. Like, they don't want to return. And you would only see them return years after, when there is no harm and there's no war going on anymore. And that is perfectly fine. The government understands that. But when you're making claims on a personal level and you're going back and forth, it is a red flag. You run the risk of losing your immigration status altogether. Okay. Now, another misconception is that you could become a permanent resident or Canadian citizen by purchasing property in Canada. So there's no program in existence that allows for an individual to become a PR by purchasing property, right? Purchasing property is just purchasing property. Sometimes you have to pay a larger deposit than a Canadian or a permanent resident, but it's still purchasing property. There's no ties to your immigration if you're purchasing property. Now, sometimes when people generally are deported from Canada, they're under the assumption that they could just easily return. So we have 3 different types of removals from Canada, or removal orders. We have departure orders that some people will get that are less serious. It means that they have to leave Canada within a 30-day period. The government gives them 30 days to leave Canada. If they don't leave Canada within 30 days, it turns into a deportation order, which is the most serious of all. And sometimes they could get an exclusion order, which causes them to be banned from entering Canada for 1 year or 5 years. So if you get an exclusion order, you get a deportation order, you can't return to Canada just like that. If you're getting an exclusion order and you're excluded from returning to Canada based on the timeline that is on that exclusion order. So if it's within 1 year, it means you have to wait 1 year until you could return to Canada. If it has 5 years because you misrepresented, you lied to the government, then you have to wait 5 years in order to return. But anytime, if you want to return before 1 year or before 5 years, you would need to apply to the government for authorization to return, which is incredibly difficult. You're not easily able to win those type cases, and usually is refused. If you're deported, you need an authorization to return to Canada in every instance, and they're not easy to get. So the idea is that you're not in a situation where you're deported from Canada, because it makes it, when you're deported, you're permanently banned, and it makes it incredibly difficult to return because you would need an authorization, special permission from the government. If you happen to sneak back into Canada without that authorization, it makes it worse in terms of your immigration. Now, another misconception is that if you gain permanent residence in Canada, you can leave the country for years at a time, right? So if you gain permanent residence in Canada, yes, you're a permanent resident and part of the job is done, but you can't just leave Canada for years at a time. There is a certain residency requirement that you need to meet. You have to be in Canada 2 years in every 5-year period. And that would mean that you're required to be in Canada for 2 years. It doesn't have to be continuous. It could be broken up into like months here and months there, but you should be in Canada every 2 years within a 5-year period. And if you breach these conditions, in terms of if you happen to be outside Canada and you're not meeting your residency obligations by being in Canada in that 2 years, in that 5-year period, as a permanent resident, the government does, there is a process where you are usually inadmissible, and they could take your permanent residence from you. So they take you to court, and you have to argue why you're not able to be in Canada for that 2 years in a 5-year period. And those cases, again, are really hard to win, because when you become a permanent resident, the the perception is that you want to be here permanently. And if you're going to be back home all the time and you're going to breaching your residency obligation, the government takes that as if you don't want to be in Canada. And so it becomes problematic in terms of winning those type of cases. So hands down, if you're outside Canada and you breach your residency obligations, you can't return. You do your court hearing remotely. And if you're inside Canada and the government found out that you breach your residency obligations, then you do your hearing inside Canada. But the result, the chances that you would lose your case is really high. Like, they're hard cases to win. Now, generally, individuals can qualify for Canadian citizenship 2 or 3 years after becoming a permanent resident if they maintain their residency in Canada. So if we look at it, it's really not that long from the time you become a Canadian, from the time you become a permanent resident. You have to be in Canada sometimes for some people 2 years if they were a student or they're a worker before, or they were in Canada for 1 year before becoming a permanent resident. They could take over that year in order to qualify within 2 years. And if they came to Canada from being a foreign national, just applying for permanent residence from outside, they could qualify for Canadian citizenship within that 3-year period. But they have to be meeting the other residency requirements. So they will have to do like a Canadian citizenship test. Sometimes some people have to do the language test. There's certain requirements that they have to meet, but it's fairly, like, Canada has the highest naturalization rate in terms of persons becoming, Canadian citizens after permanent residence. And the Canadian citizens are the only ones that have an unqualified right to be in and out of Canada without a residency period. So it means that if you're a Canadian citizen, you could be outside Canada for any amount of years, and there's no requirement that you have to be in Canada like for 2 years. But for permanent residents, you do have to be in Canada for a 2 years within a 5-year period. So being a Canadian citizen is always safer. Now, in terms of the scams, to be aware of and the tips. So you want to be aware of social media and WhatsApp messages, forwarding messages. So I know on social media is really hot. I know that for TikTok, like, they have a lot of TikToks about people applying to come to Canada, permanent resident programs, and so on. You want to be careful with those in terms of WhatsApp forwarded messages, promising jobs and study opportunities. And sometimes they guarantee your immigration results. So they tell you you're going to be approved. They promise housing, they promise transportation. They really, kind of make it seem like it's really, really easy. More than likely is a scam. Like, after we might have gone through all the processes, the legitimate ways to get status in Canada, and then the myths around Canada, you should be aware that, it is not, for some people, is not going to be incredibly difficult, but is not going to be like super easy where you don't have to do anything at all. Somebody's just going to give you your paperwork. So any of those type messages promising jobs and guaranteed immigration results, you want to look out for. You want to be aware of information on blogs and sites that are posting for the main purposes of attracting clientele and selling their services. So if you see like a blog or you see like a law firm site and they're talking positively about immigration, like, there's nothing wrong with talking positively about immigration. Like, Canadian immigration is very positive. There are a lot of opportunities. Canada is an amazing place. It's really nice. It's really good. But some of these blogs, they sell their services. So they tell you about a program. They may not tell you the whole story, or they may not tell you the truth exactly as it is. They may make it seem like it's really easy, but it's solely for the purpose of, having you book a consultation and then selling their services. So you want to be aware of that information. You want to be cross-referencing that information with the government's website to make sure that they're not carrying you down a rabbit hole. Now, you also want to be aware of companies that email you, text you, and reach out to you regarding immigration opportunities. Now, I've been in the field of immigration for 10 years, and I don't think I've ever been in a place where I've actively sought people out like a recruiter, right? Like, most immigration firms and most consultants, you have to contact them. So if they're contacting you and they're reaching out to you and they're just sending you an email in your inbox, or they're sending you a text message, like, more than likely, that is a different level of desperation. A lot of them are really successful you know, they're really not that desperate. And they have some companies that are not legit. They may be ghost companies, they may be fraudulent companies, and they're not actively emailing and texting, you know, like legit firms are not actively emailing and texting persons, you know, like every day, all day. Like sometimes they may have their marketing campaigns. I do admit to that. Like, you know, we have our marketing campaigns, but it's different if they're being pushy and they're in your email and they're sending you assessment forms and they're sending you the information or context, like if you reached out to them, right? Like if you think about it, you don't know anything about them, they don't know about you. So if you open your email and you see a pop-up come up that you're eligible, then, you know, more than likely it's a scam. You also want to be aware of immigration professionals confirming your eligibility for immigration without asking details like your education, your age, your work experience, your family unit, your family size, your financial self-sufficiency. These are things that you may want to be aware of because especially for the economic programs, like family class programs, any program, like you're gonna have to give details about your education, your age, your work experience, and so on, your family unit, your family size. And it's impossible for somebody to really tell you that you're eligible without asking these questions, right? They don't have to necessarily see all your documentation, but at least know of what your job is, right? Like your job level and so on. Like they can't tell you that you're eligible without actively engaging in a conversation where they're assessing your eligibility. The next thing is that you want to be aware of professionals who would guarantee your success and approval from the immigration authorities. No immigration professional has that power. We're actually told in the field, like lawyers and consultants, we can't give guarantee. We could never give guarantee. Officers have a lot of discretion, and even though we perfect our applications, there is a chance that, you know, like there is a chance, like you could never ever guarantee success, right? Like we could always say that we submitted a really good case on your behalf and we did our best. And we could say based on the requirements, you meet those requirements, so we don't see an issue, but we can't tell you 100% you're going to be approved. Like we can't do that. So if you find a professional that is guaranteeing your success and they're telling you that they have connections in the government and you're going to be approved, that is a red flag. Usually you can't really trust that person. And when I say professional, I use that word loosely because I'm a professional and I'm licensed and I do immigration work for individuals, but there's some professionals that, you know, are, you know, they claim to be pioneers in the field. They have their different YouTube videos and so on. But when you really check, like they're not licensed, right? They're not accountable to anyone. So if your case is lost, even though they give you a guarantee, like they're going to win and you can't ever find them or see them again, like they're not licensed. They're not held to any kind of authority. So you want to be careful with that. You want to be careful with professionals and companies that offer bundle packages or package deals. So as we know, temporary is separate and permanent residence is separate. So there's nobody that could assess you for permanent and temporary at the same time and promise you that you're going to get permanent residence at the end. So it's a long road from somebody being a student and then being a worker and then applying for permanent residence. So anybody that's offering you a bundle package or a package deal and saying, well, okay, you're going to pay me like $50,000 and I'm going to get your work permit and your children are going to be able to study and then you're going to be able to get permanent residence for yourself and your family members, usually is very fraudulent, right? And these things happen. Like usually people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars on the promise that their entire immigration pathway is taken care of. And we call this bundle packages and we call this package deals. And lawyers and consultants that are licensed are never going to do this because we're not allowed to offer bundle packages. Like if we're charging for a case, we're going to charge for your work, we're going to charge for your studying, we're going to charge for your permanent residence, all separate. Is never going to be a long-term, like give me $20,000 and we're going to handle the whole process. Is never like that. You want to make sure that you are, in terms of paying for online assessments, usually for online assessments, you might get pop-ups that says, oh, put your information in, you pay some money to get an online assessment, and they're only asking general information. So they're only confirming they're only using very general information. They're not getting at the heart of anything. They're using this general information and they're confirming that you're eligible. Usually the catch there is that they're using that platform to get you to start to pay. You put your credit card information and so on in. And then once you do the first stage, they say, oh, congrats, you're eligible to come to Canada. And then they would ask for more money soon after. So they would have a toggle. They would say, oh, do you want to go ahead and start the immigration process? It's $1,000 to start, or it's $2,000 to start, and they have your credit card information. So all you say yes, and then they charge your card for the thousands of dollars for nothing, right? And then they go and you in. So you want to be aware of online paid assessments without dealing with the actual professional that you could vouch for and you know that that is licensed. You always want to conduct a background check on law firms and immigration consultants companies. So you want to check their websites, you want to check for reviews, you want to look for them on LinkedIn. So if somebody has a company and they have the company name, you could really search them, cross-reference, go on LinkedIn, make sure that they're who they say they are. They have their information up there. Not to say that people can't lie on these platforms, but you really want to make sure that you're checking and that everything looks legit. Like if a site looks really tacky and really not good, more than likely it may be a scam if they don't have enough information. If a site doesn't have a physical business address, like you could try calling the number. There's some apps that you could get that you could call all over the world. You want to make sure that when you call these numbers, it's not like a ghost number that is just taking you to nowhere, right? You want to make sure that it's a company and you can actually reach someone. You want to check and validate the professionals through their provincial law websites or Canadian immigration consultant websites. So if you're a Canadian immigration consultant like I am, you're registered, you're licensed, you're under a regulatory body, your name would be on that site. Your company name would be on that site. If you're a lawyer, you could check the Provincial Law Society, their information will be on that site. You want to be careful because there's some people that are banned or suspended. They shouldn't be working. They're working, it becomes problematic. There's some people that are not, they're not registered at all. Like they're not lawyers. They consider themselves immigration professionals, but they're not lawyers. They're not Canadian immigration and citizenship consultants. They're just ghost consultants. That is problematic because if you lose your case, they did something wrong. Immigration is not, is not going to be held accountable. They're not going to hold that person accountable. Usually the person is in the win and there's no disciplinary process for that person. There's nothing that you could do. Like your money is just dead. So you want to make sure that you're dealing with a person that is licensed and they're legit. So I just have a couple more points and then I'll finish and then take your question. You want to be aware of any recruiter or headhunter or employer that is asking for your passport information or identity outside Canada. Sometimes it could just be for the purposes of stealing your identity, right? So identity theft is really big over here. And then if you have managed to come to Canada and you're actually inside Canada, you don't want to be giving your passport to anybody. So some employers might be saying, I want your passport for safekeeping, right? Like give me your passport for safekeeping. Sometimes that is a red flag that you're setting up yourself to be abused by that employer, right? So you don't want to give your passport for anybody. If an employer is asking for your passport in Canada, they shouldn't be holding your passport. Like no one should hold your passport. You should have your passport safe, and you should have your passport. So if an employer is asking for your passport, that is usually a serious problem. And you always want to, I'm going to close with, you always want to make sure that you're validating your information about immigrating to Canada on www.canada.ca. So that is the official government's website. So that is the government's mouth in a sense that any programs that they have is going to be on there. Any policies that they have is going to be on there. All the rules are on there. It's really hard to navigate. But if you have a problem navigating, you also use a professional that's licensed, to book a consultation and get the advice firsthand. And, nothing beats reading the information for yourself so that you have your questions that you can ask the professional with respect to your own case and what you want to get out of your immigration journey. Okay. So with that being said, I could open for questions. Thank you all. And I could take your questions at this time.
Thanks, Chantal. There's one question here. It says, given scams are really prevalent with regard to immigration opportunities, are there specific and recommended areas or sites to look for employment and immigration opportunities? perhaps government links, reputable recruiters, etc., that can be shared?
So yesterday, the slide yesterday has a couple job searching sites that are legit. And Job Bank, which is the Canada's Job Bank, is on that list from the slides yesterday as well. So that is a reputable site. That is the government site in terms of advertising, right? So employers could advertise on there. If an employer is doing an LMIA, or if they're doing an LMIA, they have to advertise on Job Bank. That is mandatory. Like, that is where they have to advertise. And then in terms of getting information, you want to go to the government's website, which is www.canada.ca. So again, that was mentioned yesterday in our presentation, and it's also mentioned again and reiterated today. So the presentation yesterday is going to be made available, and that has the Job Bank link on it, and www.canada.ca. And today we have www.canada.ca. So that is your first stop, and that is, you wouldn't go wrong with those sites. Okay, so I want to thank everyone.
Let me thank you, Chantal, for 2 days of really informative, pertinent, and relevant and up-to-date information. I trust that persons who log on in a much better place now to navigate the Canadian immigration system and to make informed decisions. And as you said, these presentations will be made available on our on YouTube, so you will be able to share it with your friends and family and refer to it from time to time. So once again, Chantal, thank you very much for making your knowledge, your expertise available. Just want to remind our listeners and our participants here that on April 26th at 6 p.m., we have a panel discussion, and that's entitled Barbadian Professionals in Canada, Opportunities, Options, and Observations, where we explore some of the challenges and opportunities Barbadians and immigrants in general, we focus on Barbadians, the face when they seek to pursue their careers and professional careers and so on, and some of the ways in which they can more effectively navigate the professional field. So you can visit our Facebook page for more information on that, and you're invited and welcome to join us and participate in that event. Once again, and there's some other events coming up too. We want to also remind Barbadians in Canada that we are expecting the Constitutional Reform Commission. They should be visiting us sometime in May. More information on that will be coming shortly, and you're invited. That's of course an in-person event, so you come to the offices of the Barbados Consulate, and you can engage the Constitutional Reform Commission in terms of exploring various changes that you want to recommend for the Constitution of Barbados. So at this time, Chantal, once again, thank you. Thank all my colleagues in Ottawa, the High Commission in Ottawa, Andre Padmore, and all my colleagues here in Toronto for making this event possible. Thank you, Chantal, and
Thank you so
hope
much.
to see you next year.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Good night.
Chantal, I'm sorry, just before you go, Chantal, there's actually one more question that somebody had. It came in late. So they're asking if they apply as a professional for permanent residency and then realize there's another pathway like family sponsorship, if they can change their application process.
They don't have to change the application process. Like immigration, you could actually apply for more than one thing concurrently. So if you have an application, it's seen as 2 different type streams. So if you do have express entry application in, and you do want to do like a sponsorship or something, you could do both, and you could just see which comes through first. So it doesn't conflict.
Okay.
It doesn't conflict. That's another thing that I probably should have added. So I'm glad that the person asked that question. It doesn't conflict.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so very much, Chantal. And everyone, you can see Chantal's information is here on the screen. And she is a private consultant. She does not work for the Consulate General of Barbados. She's a private consultant. So her information is here. If you want to contact her directly, you may do so. And as she said, both these sessions, and as Consul Gibbs said, both of these sessions are going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and the links are going to be shared with all registrants. So you will get an email sharing the links for these sessions, maybe by tonight or tomorrow morning. All people who have registered for these sessions will get an email with the link. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.